Amid the sea of fire in Berlin in late April 1945, the most powerful women of the Third Reich watched their glory turn into a living hell. They were wives, mistresses, the roses who had fully enjoyed fame alongside the men who unleashed terror across Europe. But the most horrifying detail? A wave of mass suicides, brutal torture, and merciless manhunts that spared no one. Do you believe that the moment Hitler drew his last breath, these very women became targets of a bloodthirsty hunt? Subscribe to the channel now so you won't miss the shocking hidden chapters of history. And continue with us to explore 15 parts of their bloody tragedy and their final declarations in the upcoming video. Part 1. The Shattering Beginning. After the most brutal war in human history ended, the world followed the fates of the powerful names who had committed countless atrocities. Yet the figures of the women who stood beside the leaders of the Nazi regime, wives, mistresses, and companions, are rarely mentioned. They were not merely roses living in the false glory of the Third Reich. They also enjoyed prestige and privilege thanks to their husbands' surnames, their lovers' status, or the favors granted by the regime. At the time, many believed that their life of luxury would last forever. However, the relentless currents of history spare no one. In April 1945, Berlin, the heart of the Reich, was reduced to a heap of rubble. The city no longer resembled a modern metropolis. Buildings leaned precariously, as if drunk. Shattered window panes glittered among the wreckage. And the streets had become muddy quagmires filled with broken brick and stone. The incessant roar of artillery no longer signaled triumph, but served as a funeral bell for a once mighty power. Black smoke mingled with the scorching metallic odor of bombardment, making the air suffocating and apocalyptic. It is said that standing amid that inferno, every breath felt as if oxygen had evaporated, leaving only ragged gasps and the pervasive stench of death beneath the earth. In the old chancellery bunker, hurried footsteps echoed, anxious whispers reverberated, and frantic knocks rapped against doors from those who knew they faced the harshest of fates. In that pitch-dark asylum, Eva Braun, the woman who had waited more than 10 years to be called Mrs. Hitler, finally stepped into a brief, hasty wedding ceremony. History recorded this paradoxical moment. Outside the bunker, Soviet shells pounded in waves to form a symphony of flame and smoke. Inside, the faint glow of dimmed lamps cast across a makeshift tablecloth. A meager wedding cake was hastily arranged, and warm champagne was poured in a rush, all amidst the deafening crack of gunfire and the enveloping haze of battle. Though Eva's smile glimmered with a semblance of joy, the ground trembled beneath her feet. In that instant, the image of two people exchanging vows appeared both beautiful and bitter. They were immersed in a final dream on the brink of cruel reality. Their future, if it could even be called that, was but a blurry shadow of their fading glory. From this moment, the tragedy of the Nazi roses began to spread like smoldering embers before a catastrophic blaze. Part 2. The Blood-Soaked Wedding and the Final Testament. Late on the night of April 29th, 1945, the Third Reich reached its most paradoxical culmination. Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun were married. Deep beneath the shattered streets of Berlin, in the cramped bunker of the Führer's chancellery, a handful of exhausted soldiers and pale, hollow-eyed officers gathered to witness a ceremony at once tender and grotesque, A threadbare tablecloth was spread upon a hastily borrowed desk. A chipped crystal glass was filled with lukewarm champagne, its bubbles barely rising. A simple cake, more symbolic than celebratory, was sliced with trembling hands. Eva's delicate laughter rang out, fragile against the relentless thunder of Soviet bombardment overhead. Each pop of artillery seemed to underscore the fleeting nature of joy in those final hours. She stood beside Hitler, in a plain dress, her veil pinned with a single wilted flower. His uniform, once crisp and commanding, now hung heavy with dust and fatigue. Despite the bleak surroundings, they exchanged vows with solemn conviction, as if binding themselves to one another in defiance of the collapsing world above. Witnesses dared not smile. Some furtively wiped tears as they recited lines of loyalty. Others scanned the dim tunnel entrance, half expecting Red Army boots to pound through at any moment. The ceremony lasted scarcely 15 minutes. Yet within that span, love and doom interwove so tightly that they seemed indistinguishable. When the last glass was emptied and the final crumb of cake consumed, there remained only the echo of shells and the acrid scent of gunmetal. At dawn, in the same cramped quarters, Hitler sat at a small wooden desk, illuminated by a single flickering lamp. He dipped his pen and began drafting his political testament, the final act of a lifetime spent cultivating power and betrayal. His handwriting, once authoritative, now quivered slightly, betraying the weight of impending defeat. He spoke through written word of treachery within the ranks, of enemies circling at the gates of the fatherland, and of unwavering loyalty required to the very end. Though his language shimmered with the rhetoric of hope, it could not mask the grim reality pressing at the bunker doors. Above him, the rumble of marching boots grew louder as Soviet forces encircled the ruined city. The bunker's steel door clanged shut with a finality that reverberated down the corridor. Officers exchanged furtive glances, and the low hum of whispered escape plans fell silent. The air grew colder, tinged with the telltale sweetness of hydrogen cyanide, the infamous bitter almond odor that drifted under locked hatches. Eva, still clad in her modest wedding gown, knelt beside Hitler's desk. She read his testament and placed her hand upon the page, her pale features set with determined resolve. She knew that beyond these walls lay only capture or death. In that stark moment, with the world outside burning and the legacy of 1,000 crimes closing in, she made her choice. Together, they would step into the fortress of death, their final act entwined as tightly as their vows had bound them just hours before. Thus ended the blood-soaked celebration and gave birth to the Reich's last will, a haunting prelude to the final curtain on a tragic epoch. Part 3. The Goebbels Tragedy. In the aftermath of Hitler and Eva Braun's suicide, the bunker fell into a stunned silence that seemed to echo the collapse of an entire regime. Amid this void, Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Propaganda, and Hitler's most loyal lieutenant and his wife Magda stood as the last high-ranking Nazi couple still alive. Once the purveyor of orchestrated mass rallies and sinister speeches, Goebbels now confronted a fate beyond political theater. Yet it was Magda's unyielding devotion to National Socialism and her children's indelible role in its propaganda that ultimately sealed their family's tragic end. Magda Goebbels had long intertwined her identity and that of her 6 children with the mythic destiny of the Third Reich. She was often portrayed in Nazi publications as the ideal Aryan mother, blessing each child at grandiose ceremonies to serve as symbols of the regime's supposed moral righteousness. When Berlin lay in ruins and Hitler lay dead, Magda saw no purpose in carrying on without the Führer. In the dimly lit corridors of the Führer bunker, she summoned her children, Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Holdine, Hedda, and Heidi in turn, each dressed in their best attire. Crisp and clean, despite the surrounding decay. Their faces bore a mixture of awe and apprehension, unaware of the irreversible choice about to be imposed upon them. Inside the sole room, still aglow by a single flickering table lamp, Magda stood resolute. The distant rumble of Soviet artillery had finally subsided to a mournful drone, as if the world itself hesitated before the final act of this grim drama. A uniformed nurse appeared, carrying a small box of cyanide capsules distributed by the regime's most faithful followers. Magda gave her quiet permission. One by one, the nurse offered the capsules to the children, who each swallowed the bitter poison with trembling lips. Their soft sobs mixed with the haunted silence. And then, nothing. When the door opened, it revealed an unthinkable sight. The entire Goebbels family lay motionless on the simple cot and floor, Magda and Joseph at the center, flanked by their children in a tragic tableau. No victim of the war's bombardment could rival the poignancy of these 6 innocent lives extinguished in the name of ideologue loyalty. Their deaths were more than an act of despair. They were the ultimate testament to the fanaticism that had driven millions to destruction. As the family collapsed into stillness, the bunker's corridors emptied with newfound urgency. Survivors fled upward into the crumbling city, seeking capture by the Allies or absorbing themselves in Berlin's chaos. Officers, once steadfast, abandoned their posts, while ordinary soldiers slipped away into shadows. The physical space of the bunker remained intact for hours longer, but its moral foundation lay shattered. The Goebbels tragedy served as the final confirmation that the ideology they had once propelled was now an empty shell, worthy only of silent anguish. Thus ended the saga of the most devoted Nazi couple of all. Their collective suicide, far removed from a private sorrow, stands as a chilling monument to the power of totalitarian indoctrination. In that subterranean chamber, amid the echo of fading bombs, the last embers of the Third Reich flickered out not with triumph, but with the haunting silence of a family gone forever. Part 4. The Hunt and Humiliation. The moment the bunker's massive doors creaked open, Soviet troops flooded into the shattered streets of Berlin. With steely resolve, they were the vanguard of vengeance, tasked with eradicating every remnant of the fallen regime. No longer bound by military decorum, they swept through the ruins, seizing officers, bureaucrats, and without exception, any woman with ties to the Nazi hierarchy. In the chaos of broken buildings and smoldering wreckage, these women found themselves caught in a storm of retribution. On the crumbling avenues once lined with statues and flags, women were dragged from collapsed doorways, their dresses torn and faces streaked with dust and tears. Soldiers, wielding rifles and batons, assaulted them mercilessly, shouting accusations as though each strike could erase the memory of atrocity. Goddess of propaganda, one man snarled as he kicked a trembling figure in a once beautiful evening gown. Mistress of murder, others were shoved headfirst into mud-filled trenches, their cries swallowed by the roar of tanks grinding over cracked pavement. Beyond the blows of physical violence, many women endured sexual assault and calculated psychological torment. Those rumored to have served as pay dirt girls for top officials or mistresses of SS commanders suffered the harshest treatment. Stripped of all privileges, they were paraded through the streets with collars of barbed wire. Their jewelry rings, bracelets, necklaces ripped from their bodies and cast into the mud. Any signifier of Frau or Fraulein was formally stripped. Captives were thereafter identified only by a hastily scrawled surname and a crudely painted number on a threadbare armband. This public degradation served as both punishment and spectacle. Journalists embedded with the Soviet ranks snapped photographs. Once glamorous socialites, the very embodiment of Nazi high society. Now, caked in blood and grime. In one image that later circulated clandestinely, a young woman in a tattered silk dress clutched a torn photograph of her husband, a poster portrait of a Reichsmarschall, moments before she was shoved into a transport truck bound for an improvised detention center. The camera captured her haunted eyes, wide with shock and fear, forever contrasting with the smug gaze once immortalized in propaganda. In makeshift holding camps converted from schools and factories, the officers in waiting abandoned any pretense of humanity. Women were herded into overcrowded halls, forced to stand shoulder to shoulder in silence, broken only by the barked orders of Soviet guards. Lights were left on day and night to disorient them. Each sudden blackout preceded a volley of interrogation yelling, threats, and random beatings intended to fracture their will. Medical personnel, disregarding the Geneva Conventions, conducted invasive examinations under the guise of security screenings, further violating their dignity. Amid this torrent of brutality, a few women clung to the fragile hope of justice. They whispered of international law, of the coming Nuremberg trials, and of the Allies' promises to punish war criminals. Yet hope offered little comfort when the reality of physical scars and shattered psyches bore constant witness to their ordeal. The hunt for Nazi women had become indiscriminate, fueled by the righteous fury of victors and the desire for collective atonement. As days passed, the streets slowly emptied of captives. Survivors were funneled into formal POW camps or released into a devastated civilian world. But even those who escaped the worst of the beatings carried invisible marks, the stigma of accusation, the memory of torn garments, and the echo of boots on cobblestones. Their ordeal underscored a brutal truth. In the fall of an evil empire, the lines between justice and revenge blurred, and the women who once basked in power's glow tasted, in turn, a dehumanizing reckoning amidst Berlin's ruins. Part 5. The Wave of Suicidal Deaths. When Berlin officially surrendered in early May 1945, small-town newspapers began reporting a startling series of unexplained deaths among the wives and mistresses of Nazi officers. Headlines such as "Mistress of SS Officer Found Dead at Home" or "Germans Widowed by Propaganda Minister Commit Suicide" appeared almost daily in local bulletins. Rather than face humiliation, trial, or capture by the Allies, many of these women chose pills, potent alcohol, or the cyanide capsules, once reserved for high-ranking Nazis. Their suicides were not merely driven by fear of retribution. They were a final declaration that death, however shameful, was preferable to public disgrace and the loss of the last semblance of honor. Across the German countryside, reports emerged of women in their 30s and 40s found lifeless in elegant homes now stripped of luxury. Some had swallowed entire bottles of barbiturates. Others had drowned in bathtubs filled with whiskey. Cyanide, known among the elite as the bitter almond solution, claimed the lives of those who had once believed in a grand vision of Aryan purity. Each suicide carried the weight of a political statement by ending their own lives. These women insisted on maintaining control over their fate, even as the world they knew crumbled around them. Among the most notable cases was that of Lena Heydrich, widow of Reinhard Heydrich, the principal architect of the Final Solution, who had been assassinated in Prague in 1942. Lena retreated to the relative safety of Fair Island in northern Germany, a place untouched by Soviet forces. For weeks after the city fell, she lived in a secluded seaside cottage, her days occupied with caring for her two young children and managing the family's dwindling savings. Yet rumors of her identity spread quickly, prompting British officers to launch an investigation into her wartime activities and her potential complicity. When British military police arrived at her door, they expected to find incontrovertible evidence of her involvement in her husband's genocidal policies. Instead, Lena maintained an unwavering denial. She presented herself as a loyal German wife who had been ignorant of her husband's crimes. She produced letters and personal journals, mostly benign observations of domestic life, to support her claim. Faced with insufficient proof and wary of a public scandal, the authorities chose not to prosecute. Lena Heydrich thus slipped quietly back into civilian life, her past lingering like a shadow she could never fully escape. While many families tore themselves apart through suicide, Lena's survival through denial stands as a stark counterpoint to the era's desperate final acts. Freed from legal charges, but not from societal stigma, she remained in Germany under a cloud of suspicion. Her children grew up haunted by whispered rumors of their mother's legacy, and Lena herself died, decades later, still burdened by the crimes of the man she had married. In her silence and survival, she embodied the complex aftermath of Nazi women's fates, some choosing death over dishonor, others clinging to life through the fragile shield of denial. Part 6. The Admiral's Widow's Farewell Letter and the Flight of the SS Roses. In the wake of Hitler's death and the Goebbels tragedy, panic and despair rippled through the ranks of those still loyal to the fallen regime. Among the first to choose death over dishonor was the wife of Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedberg, known in naval circles as a steadfast partner to one of the Kriegsmarine's highest officers. She issued a single, stark note before taking her own life. "I cannot live in a world where his honor has been stripped away." Those 8 words, scrawled in elegant script on hotel stationery, became a bitter testament to the absolute devotion and fatal fatalism that gripped many within the Reich's inner circle. Meanwhile, elsewhere in Bavaria and Austria, a different group of women, mistresses of high-ranking SS officers, embarked on desperate flights through the smoldering aftermath of collapse. They were women accustomed to luxury and privilege, now relegated to shadows and subterfuge. Under cover of darkness, they dyed their hair lighter shades to blur the sharp features, once immortalized in Nazi propaganda photographs. They borrowed peasant skirts and blouses from village women, trading silk gowns for coarse linen and mud-caked boots. Each carried forged identity papers, either factory IDs or forged work permits, issued by sympathetic local officials still clinging to faded Nazi documents. Yet the very notoriety that had once elevated these roses now endangered them. In tiny hamlets ravaged by hunger and fear, villagers recognized the faces they had seen at SS banquets or official rallies. Some turned them in to advancing Allied patrols, while others delivered them to Soviet units in exchange for rations or a night's shelter. In one Tyrolean village, an SS mistress was discovered by a group of farmers who chased her across fields until she collapsed. They bound her hands with rope, draped her over a horse, and handed her over to a Soviet lieutenant who later reported her as exquisitely dressed, yet trembling like a lamb. End of. Only a handful managed to slip across the borders into Austria or Switzerland. Foremost among these was a woman known only in Gestapo files as Ingrid M. Org. Her case became legend among post-war investigators. Traveling under the guise of a Red Cross nurse, she boarded a dilapidated bus bound for Zurich. In a small suitcase, she carried a single change of clothes and a counterfeit Red Cross travel pass. During a brief interrogation by Swiss border guards, she maintained a serene composure, presenting her forged credentials and offering a feigned limp as evidence of wartime service. In reality, it was a calculated performance. Tucked at the bottom of her suitcase lay a small glass vial of cyanide, a final insurance policy against capture. In later interviews, Ingrid confessed that she had prepared the cyanide the moment she heard Soviet tanks rolling into Munich, knowing that discovery would mean torture or public execution. Yet, she never needed to use it. Her disguise held firm until she vanished into the rolling hills outside Basel. There, she lived under a pseudonym, working in a small clinic and cutting all ties to her past. While Allied intelligence continued to collect dossiers on suspected war criminals, Ingrid M. evaded them completely, a ghost among the wounded and displaced. Her escape stands as a stark counterpoint to the many who chose suicide. It underscores how, in the chaos of defeat, meticulous planning and sheer audacity could outmaneuver the collapse of an empire. As Germany reeled from its defeat, the fates of its elite women diverged sharply. Some embraced death in a final act of allegiance, while others seized the slender chance of anonymity and survival. In either choice lay a common thread, a measure of the desperation and fanaticism that had long fueled the darkest chapter of the 20th century. Part 7. Small Town Alerts and the Psychology of the Nazi Roses. In the weeks following Germany's formal surrender in early May 1945, local bulletins and small-town flyers began to record a disturbing pattern. The sudden, unexplained deaths of women once identified as wives or mistresses of high-ranking Nazi officers. Headlines were deliberately vague. Mrs. H., widow of senior officer, found deceased at home, offering no cause of death. Though details were seldom disclosed, the undertone was unmistakable. These women had either taken their own lives or met violent ends in near total secrecy. For some, suicide represented the ultimate act of loyalty, a final testament to the ideology they had served. For others, it was an escape from the terror of public trials, prison sentences, and societal contempt. Most of these incidents occurred in rural villages and small towns, where whispered lists of suspected Nazi affiliates circulated by word of mouth. Villagers, many suffering hunger and exhaustion after years of war, felt empowered to expose any woman who had once walked at a propaganda rally beside a senior official or whose photograph adorned local newspaper pages. In hushed tones and furtive glances at market stalls, anger and fear fermented into denunciations. Rumors spread swiftly. She was always at the officer's side, or I saw her distributing leaflets in 1943. That simmering resentment gave license for midnight raids on private homes, on nights lit only by moonlight. Groups of local youth or hastily organized militias would storm into residences. Women were dragged from their beds, their doors kicked open without explanation. Some were bound and driven to impromptu holding centers, schoolhouses, or abandoned barns where no official warrants were produced and no reasons given. Detainees spent hours or days in these makeshift jails, subjected to intimidation and spontaneous interrogations by villagers convinced of their guilt. The boundary between fear and fury blurred as personal vendettas masqueraded as acts of justice. Yet not every woman succumbed to despair or capture. A handful quickly recognized the perilous moment and set about erasing their past. They gathered incriminating correspondence letters from SS commanders or photographs taken at official functions and burned them in backyard fires. Albums of propaganda-era images were buried under garden soil, sealed in oilskin wrappings to degrade beyond recognition. Some enlisted the help of sympathetic former servants to dispose of jewelry and insignia, trading them for food or forged documents. Their objective was not to evade prosecution by rightful courts, but simply to avoid being identified in the first wave of Allied roundups. As Allied troops advanced into the hinterlands, their patrols were overwhelmed by the volume of suspicious persons. A single nod of recognition from a local informant could consign a woman to indefinite custody. A single forged pass might enable another to slip through checkpoint controls. In this chaotic environment, the ability to appear indistinguishable from the countless displaced persons was itself a survival skill. For the few who mastered it, anonymity offered a second chance at life, though always under the specter of discovery. Through these small towns' silent alerts and secret hunts, the Nazi roses faced their deepest reckoning. Some found death as their only refuge. Others chose subterfuge to outlast the storm. In either case, the psychological toll was immense, revealing the far-reaching legacy of belief and betrayal that had bound these women to a fallen empire. Part 8. The Art of Erasure and Lives in Hiding. When Allied soldiers knocked on doors across battered Germany, any trace of a woman's former luxury, even a single photograph of her in an opulent villa or at a grand Nazi gala, could mean imprisonment. To escape this fate, many chose drastic reinvention. They adopted new surnames, sometimes borrowing the names of deceased, distant relatives, and enrolled in vocational schools to learn trades far removed from their past lives: dressmaking, carpentry, pottery. They scoured local markets for simple peasant garments or tailored drab uniforms to blend in. Some women obtained official recognition as war widows, a status that garnered sympathy and occasional support from overwhelmed municipal offices. Yet these tactics offered no guarantee of safety. In certain villages, word-of-mouth networks of informants sprang up instantly. A butcher's assistant might recall serving that elegant lady before the war, or a postman might whisper about letters once addressed to an SS lieutenant's companion. Any hint of prior prominence invited scrutiny. Still, a handful of women managed to slip through the net. They survived the frantic roundups of May 1945 and endured into 1946, by which time Allied intelligence had narrowed its focus to the most dangerous figures. These lone survivors quietly constructed new identities from the debris of their old lives and rarely, if ever, spoke of the silk gowns and champagne receptions they once knew. Anonymity proved both liberation and prison. Former debutantes and society hostesses now found themselves as humble seamstresses, handling thread and needle instead of directing lavish banquets. A woman who once owned a vast estate learned to smile politely behind the counter of a village grocery. A celebrated salon frequenter became a potter's apprentice, shaping clay instead of commanding rallies. To neighbors unaware of their hidden pasts, they were simply industrious townsfolk. Yet behind every polite greeting lay the tense vigilance of a fugitive. Every inquiry about origins, every lingering glance at their hands, spurred a silent prayer that their carefully constructed personas would hold. Living this way demanded constant alertness. Days were spent mastering new dialects and concealing any accent that hinted at urban sophistication. Nights brought no relief. The sudden chime of a doorbell at midnight could send hearts racing, minds flashing to old propaganda posters plastered with their images. Some women installed simple latches on back doors or learned to slip away under the cover of darkness before dawn. A few kept cyanide tablets hidden among hairpins, a grim reminder that the possibility of discovery was never far away. In this clandestine existence, ordinary routines took on extraordinary weight. Boiling water for laundry meant checking mirrors for reflection. Buying bread required memorizing every local face, and passing a stranger on the street could trigger a desperate scramble to recall assumed names. Over time, the raw terror of those first post-surrender weeks gave way to a dull ache of uncertainty, an ever-present fear that tomorrow, or next week, or next year, everything might collapse, and their real names would be dragged back into the light. Through all of it, the women who mastered the art of erasure remained shadows on the edges of history, survivors who traded former grandeur for obscurity, never fully certain whether their past would remain buried forever. Part 9. The Systematic Manhunt and Interrogation Sessions. By mid-1945, the wave of mass suicides among Nazi women had slowed, and the Allied forces shifted into a methodical campaign of suppression. Intelligence officers compiled exhaustive lists of suspects, not only military officers and government officials, but also the wives, mistresses, and female companions who had mingled with them in the gilded halls of power. British and American units fanned out across villages and cities, scrutinizing residences against these lists. A single old photograph or a reported name was sufficient cause for a dawn raid. Soldiers would knock on doors before sunrise, arms ready, and haul the accused away for questioning. Once in custody, the women faced grueling interrogation sessions that could stretch for hours or even days on end. Uniformed officers and translators pressed them for details on their political beliefs, the extent of their involvement in party activities, and every nuance of the social gatherings they had attended. Agent demanded guest lists, asked about menus served at lavish banquets, and inquired into conversations held in private salons. Even those who insisted they were merely a wife or completely unaware of politics found their testimony met with skepticism. Under the relentless pressure of shouted accusations, flashing lights in the interview room, and veiled threats of severe punishment, many broke down or fell silent, their denials drowned out by the clack of typewriters recording every word. Behind the scenes, Allied intelligence sifted through captured Nazi documents, correspondence, membership cards, internal memoranda in search of corroborating evidence. Each scrap of paper was a potential link between a woman's name and the crimes of the regime. Some detainees produced work records or testimonials from neighbors to demonstrate that they had held no significant role. These women were sometimes released after a week or two, yet the majority were shipped off to military jails or re-education camps. where uniforms replaced evening gowns and identification numbers supplanted family names, stripped of jewelry and fine clothing. They wore the same drab garments as convicted war criminals, a stark testament to their fall from grace. For these women, each step down the corridor toward the interrogation chamber was a reminder of how fragile power and prestige could be. Where once they had entered grand ballrooms under the glow of crystal chandeliers, they now walked through echoing hallways in steel-toed boots. The random clang of cell doors and the murmur of guards replaced the strains of orchestra music that once heralded their arrival. Friendships forged in the echelons of Nazi high society proved worthless here. Loyalty was measured by documentary proof, not whispered recollections. Over time, some former Roses of the Reich emerged from captivity, their release contingent on the absence of any incriminating evidence. Yet, even those free to go often found themselves unwelcome in post-war society, their names forever linked with a fallen regime. Others languished behind barbed wire fences for months, enduring bureaucratic delays and shifting political priorities as the Allied trials in Nuremberg drew global attention. These women were relegated to footnotes, minor players in history's grand reckoning, yet their personal ordeals underscored a broader truth. In the aftermath of totalitarian collapse, the machinery of justice often sweeps up, everyone cast in its vast shadow, unraveling lives, one interrogation at a time. Part 10. The climax of high-profile arrests. Among the myriad women detained in the Allied sweep, Emmy Goering stood out. As the most conspicuous figure, once a celebrated stage actress in pre-war Germany, she had seamlessly reinvented herself as the glamorous wife of Hermann Goering, Hitler's second-in-command and head of the Luftwaffe. Emblazoned on countless Nazi propaganda posters, Emmy was portrayed as the epitome of Aryan elegance, forever poised beneath crystal chandeliers. Yet when American troops stormed her opulent mansion on the outskirts of Berlin, they found not merely a socialite, but the curator of a vast private art collection, works looted from museums and Jewish families across occupied Europe. Photographs swiftly circulated of Emmy standing amidst canvases by Rembrandt and Renoir, her jeweled hands resting on gilded frames. These images became incontrovertible evidence of complicity, overriding her claims of being just a silent wife, ignorant of politics. Within hours of the raid, crates of stolen art were loaded onto military trucks, and Emmy was escorted to a provisional detention center in a former army barracks. There, she endured relentless interrogation sessions under glaring lights, her voice echoing off concrete walls as officers pressed her for details on the acquisition, shipment routes, and her husband's darkest secrets. Month after month, she answered the same questions, her denials growing less certain as fresh documents surfaced. Parallel to Emmy's ordeal was the case of Ilse Hess, spouse of Rudolf Hess, Hitler's former deputy, who had infamously flown solo to Scotland in 1941. British authorities regarded Ilse as a vital source of insight into Hess's motives and his clandestine ties to the Nazi hierarchy. When she was apprehended at her countryside retreat near Munich, she faced exhaustive interviews that spanned political strategy, personal correspondence, and the secret messages, if any, that had passed between her husband and the top brass. Although no formal charges were ultimately brought against her, Ilse was placed under stringent surveillance, her movements restricted, and her residency monitored. She was labeled a long-term security concern, a designation that kept her under the watchful eyes of military police for years to come. Meanwhile, in the Soviet-occupied eastern zones, the approach was even harsher. Women seized in nocturnal raids rarely saw the inside of an interrogation room. Instead, they were thrust directly onto transports bound for labor camps deep within the USSR. Among these unfortunate souls was Elsa von Griffenberg, a well-known Viennese socialite who had once hosted lavish soirees attended by SS officers. Soviet troops discovered her at a gala reception, still clad in an evening gown, her lipstick smudged and heels caked with mud. Witnesses recall her being bundled into a military truck under shouts of "fascist scum." Her disappearance later confirmed only through sparse camp records. A single grainy photograph shows Elsa standing in a straw-floored barracks, eyes sunken, frame stooped beneath the weight of hard labor, and then she vanished from the archives altogether. By the close of 1945, the Third Reich's power had been extinguished not only on the battlefields, but within the bleak corridors of interrogation centers and the barbed wire confines of prison compounds. The once luminescent roses of Nazi high society, Emmy Goering, Ilse Hess, Elsa von Griffenberg, and countless others were reduced to hollow figures, their pride stripped bare and their gazes heavy with fear. In those final months, no chandelier-lit ballroom nor polished limousine remained to protect them. Instead, they navigated a new reality of steel doors, marching boots, and whispered accusations, a stark coda to the reign of terror in which they had once flourished. Part 11. Conditions in Allied detention camps. Once in custody, many of the women formerly associated with Nazi leadership found themselves confined within Allied detention centers repurposed from military installations. These camps varied widely in their conditions. In some locations, detainees received new uniforms and sufficient food rations, but strict discipline ruled their daily lives. They slept in rows of bunk beds under cold barodi, uninsulated roofs, and braced themselves for roll call before dawn. In other camps, they shared overcrowded, damp dormitories with common criminals where the stench of unwashed bodies and the clang of metal bunks underscored the absence of any preferential treatment. Each morning began with the donning of ill-fitting caps and the assembly of prisoners in formation for head counts that stretched endlessly into the day. Beyond that rigid routine, there were no privileges, recreation, correspondence, or private confinements were strictly prohibited, mirroring the treatment reserved for war offenders. Interrogations formed the cornerstone of the camp regime. Women were escorted to makeshift interview rooms, often converted guard towers or former officers' quarters, where they faced hours of questioning under glare lamps. The sessions were repeated frequently as interrogators sought consistency in testimonies. Questions probed every aspect of their lives, their political loyalties, attendance at lavish banquets, and the contents of menus served at high-level meetings. Some officers demanded guest lists and personal anecdotes, treating even the smallest detail as potential evidence of complicity. Despite occasional spiritual support services arranged by Red Cross chaplains, the psychological toll remained immense. Stripped of their titles and forced to surrender all jewelry and finery, these once pampered women now wore coarse uniforms bearing identification numbers. Images circulated of slender wrists in handcuffs and stiff collars around prisoners' necks, powerful reminders of how abruptly privilege could be stripped away. Life within the camp walls exposed detainees to a broad cross-section of humanity's aftermath. They encountered high-ranking Nazi officials convicted of war crimes, their faces drawn and spirits broken. Side by side, they stood next to women accused primarily through association, those whose only crime was sharing a surname or having attended a single public function. Each evening, the barracks fell into a stifling silence, broken only by the measured footsteps of patrolling guards and the distant hum of floodlights. A few resolute prisoners kept hidden diaries, convinced that one day history would vindicate them. But most clung to the simple hope of surviving until release, praying for normalcy, without fully understanding the social exile that awaited them. Release, when it came, did not guarantee freedom in any meaningful sense. Many women emerged from the camps to find their communities transformed, their families estranged, and their reputations irreparably stained. Local employers balked at hiring anyone connected to Nazi officials, and neighbors often whispered accusations as detainees tried to rebuild their lives. In the face of this lingering ostracism, the social sentence they endured often proved harsher than any formal legal punishment. Freed from barbed wire and roll call, they nonetheless remained caged by suspicion and shame, a testament to the enduring consequences of proximity to tyranny. Part 12. Diverging Destinies. From Conditional Release to Lifelong Incarceration. In the weeks and months following the initial roundups, Allied authorities implemented a rigorous classification system for women tied to the Nazi regime. Suspects were sorted into tiers based on evidence of active participation or dubious association. Those deemed of no significant political role underwent background checks, interviews with neighbors, reviews of work records, and scrutiny of wartime correspondence. If investigators found no proof of ideological commitment or involvement in party machinery, these women were quietly released. Each had to sign a binding declaration pledging not to disclose any information related to the regime's inner workings and to report regularly to local authorities for periodic status checks. Freed from barbed wire confines, they returned to civilian life under the cloak of anonymity, often resuming mundane routines in drab clothing. Yet behind stoic facades, many carried an unbearable burden of guilt and a perpetual dread that their forged freedoms could be revoked at any moment. Conversely, those classified as high risk, primarily the wives and mistresses of senior Nazi leaders, remained in custody indefinitely. By 1946, many had been transferred from military detention to civilian re-education camps or long-term military prisons. A select few faced military tribunals not as defendants, but as witnesses whose testimonies were deemed crucial to prosecuting top war criminals. Their public appearances at these proceedings, though not formal trials against them, made headlines and inadvertently cemented their notoriety. Photographs of them in the witness box, stern-faced, whisked from cells to courtrooms, under heavy guard spread through newspapers and radio bulletins. Rather than fade into obscurity, their names echoed in post-war discourse, ensuring that life beyond captivity would be fraught with stigma. The stark contrast in outcomes hinged not only on each woman's proximity to power, but also on her ability to craft a compelling self-defense. Some, with shrewd legal counsel or well-timed character references, convinced authorities that they were ignorant bystanders, just housewives, victims of circumstance. These women often recounted a credible narrative of domestic seclusion, insisting they never attended political meetings, never spoke of ideology, and remained oblivious to the true nature of the regime's crimes. Their plausible denials supported by testimonials from sympathetic acquaintances or documentary gaps, earned them expedited release. In sharp contrast, any woman linked to intercepted confidential letters, propaganda stills bearing her image, or contradictory witness statements languished in limbo. For them, each piece of evidence, however, minor, served as a chain, anchoring them to suspicion. Interrogators dredged up inconsistencies in their accounts, prolonging detention as they sought corroboration from scattered archives. This bifurcation of fates underscored a grim reality. In post-war Germany, survival often depended more on performance than truth. The ability to dissociate from one's past, to adopt the persona of a passive spouse, or to weave a believable alibi, became life's most precious skill. Those who maneuvered successfully walked free into a society struggling to redefine itself, burdened by the necessity of reconciliation, yet wary of unpunished complicity. Meanwhile, the rest, unable to wash away their connections, remained behind the heavy doors of prisons and camps, their destinies sealed by the very bonds they once wore as emblems of status. In the end, the collapse of the Third Reich did not produce a single, uniform reckoning, but a spectrum of outcomes that reflected both the arbitrariness and imperatives of justice in the war's uneasy aftermath. Part 13: Life After Prison and the Social Puzzle. When the gates of detention finally opened, many of the women linked to the Nazi hierarchy stepped back into a world that no longer welcomed them. Public contempt greeted their return, whispers followed them down narrow streets, and shabby apartment blocks became their only refuge. Former socialites and secretaries of power now eked out a living through manual trades. Some mended clothes in dim workshops, others hawked groceries at crowded market stalls. Those with a modicum of savings tried to maintain dignity, but found themselves forced to change their surnames and relocate to distant cities, hoping anonymity would shield them from the gossip that trailed like a shadow. Shopkeepers shuttered their doors at their approach, and children on the sidewalks pointed with cruel curiosity, demanding, "Were you a Nazi wife?" For the more affluent women who clung to inherited wealth, the price of survival was self-imposed exile. They confined themselves to the confines of private estates or discreet urban flats, refusing invitations, declining interviews, and shunning any public appearance. Each social engagement risked exposure, so they built walls of silence around their lives. Their silk gowns, once the height of elegance, became relics too painful to keep. Many burned them in backyard bonfires, while others buried them deep beneath garden soil. Day to day, life after the war was stripped of glamour, now centered on securing basic necessities, paying bills, and maintaining a facade of normalcy. Some women took a different path, attempting to reclaim their narratives by penning memoirs or cooperating with journalists seeking first-hand accounts of the regime's inner workings. In the 1960s and 70s, a handful of slender volumes appeared under modest imprints, their authors hoping to portray themselves as naive bystanders or victims of circumstance. They recounted varnished memories of opulent balls, charitable works, and private sorrow. Yet the public's appetite for forgiveness was scant. These memoirs were met with anger and disbelief. Critics accused the authors of opportunism, insisting that ignorance was no excuse for complicity. As a result, most of these books vanished quickly from shelves and libraries, relegated to obscurity by a society still grappling with the horrors of its recent past. Even those who escaped the harshest reprisals found themselves ensnared in a persistent social sentence. Neighbors who once raised toasts at grand dinner parties now cast wary glances. Employment opportunities were scarce. Few employers dared hire someone whose name was linked to Nazi leadership. Invitations to community events ceased, as committees hesitated to associate with figures so tainted. In some rural areas, women faced outright hostility, stones thrown at windows, anonymous letters demanding they leave town, and cries of, "Go home to your Führer, M." Yet amidst this harsh climate, pockets of compassion emerged. A handful of charitable organizations offered vocational training and modest loans to facilitate genuine reintegration. Some towns granted discreet pardons or work permits under new identities, but these gestures were exceptions, not the norm. For most, the path to quiet survival stretched long and uncertain, marked by the constant tension between hiding from the past and forging a new future. In the end, the post-prison existence of these women revealed a complex social puzzle. They had played roles willing or not in the machinery of a brutal regime, and now they bore its indelible stain. Their efforts to rebuild lives, erase memory, or reclaim dignity, collided with a collective memory that refused to forget. The fate of these former roses became a testament to the enduring power of history. Once you have been at the heart of tyranny, even the most determined reinvention struggles to escape the imprint of that dark chapter. Part 14. Pressure on the next generation. The children of these Nazi-affiliated women inherited a legacy far heavier than any school bag. In the classroom, pupils whispered and pointed, chanting taunts like, "Your mother was a fascist." Classmates recoiled at the mere mention of their surnames. And some teachers, whether out of fear or resentment, treated them with icy formality. Playground games faltered as kids refused to pass the ball to the daughter of a war criminal, while holiday invitations bypassed their households entirely. Faced with mounting ostracism, many families resorted to drastic measures, formal name changes to erase any link to their mother's former identity, or arranging for their children to study abroad in South America, Australia, or Canada, destinations seen as distant enough to offer a fresh start. Growing up under this cloud of inherited guilt, these young people lived with anxieties no child should bear. Each introduction required a stifled explanation. Yes, my mother was married to a Nazi officer, but I had no part in it. They learned early that apologies must precede every conversation, that smiles had to be practiced in front of the mirror, and that defensive posture was crucial when encountering new acquaintances. This perpetual state of apology and exposure bred deep-seated insecurity. For some, it sparked defiance. For many others, it crushed any sense of belonging, turning adolescence into a gauntlet of whispered judgments and furtive glances. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, a wave of emigration swept through this stigmatized youth, eager to shed their native soil's burden. Dozens applied for visas to Argentina, Brazil, Australia, and Canada. Under new names, often adopted upon arrival at immigration checkpoints, they enrolled in vocational schools, took odd jobs in factories, or joined agricultural settlements sponsored by refugee programs. The hope was twofold: to escape the faint but relentless echo of their parents' notoriety, and to construct identities defined by personal achievements rather than inherited shame. For those who succeeded, the cost was high: lifelong separation from birth families, the erasure of childhood memories, and the perpetual fear that someone, somewhere, would one day unearth their true origins. Back in post-war Germany, opportunities for upward mobility gradually closed. Public sector jobs, once a path to stability, remained elusive. Civil service examinations often disqualified candidates with stigmatized backgrounds. Even when official records showed no legal disqualification, banks, wary of reputational risk, denied business loans to applicants whose family histories raised eyebrows. No matter how modest the venture, social clubs and charitable organizations, mindful of public sentiment, hesitated to extend invitations or sponsorships. The era's rhetoric of reconstruction and reconciliation rarely extended to families of disgraced Nazi associates, leaving them confined to the margins of a society ostensibly dedicated to rebirth. Thus, an entire generation became what historians would later call ghosts of history. They bore no direct responsibility for the Third Reich's atrocities, yet they carried its indelible stain in street markets and university halls, in church pews and government offices. They lived half-lives of muted existence, never fully integrated, never truly free. Their stories, when told, served as poignant reminders that the consequences of tyranny ripple forward across generations, and that even in a world striving for justice and renewal, the shadow of the past can linger long after the towers have fallen. Part 15: Bloody Legacy and Eternal Judgment. By the time most of the women who had once graced the palaces and ballrooms of the Nazi hierarchy passed away throughout the 1970s, 80s, and into the 90s, the world had largely ceased to recount their stories. Their obituaries were typically sparse, noting only that the late Mrs. X was once married to a high-ranking officer, without peeling back the layers of their complicity or influence. To historians, it often seemed as though time had quietly expunged them from the narrative. Yet photographs remain, archival image of elegant soirées beside brutal dictators, lavish banquets featuring stolen artworks, and portraits in the finest gowns, visual testaments preserved in museums and research archives. In contemporary studies of the Third Reich, scholars emphasize that the role of these women cannot be overlooked. Though they never shouldered rifles or signed government decrees, their presence at official events lent social legitimacy to the regime. Many managed household finances that indirectly funded propaganda campaigns or charitable arms of the Nazi Party. Others circulated ideological pamphlets among social circles or hosted salons where key figures shared and validated extremist doctrines. Their social networks served as channels for disseminating Nazi ideals into private spheres, drawing relatives, friends, and acquaintances into complicity. Whether witting or coerced, the long-term consequences of their participation endure in collective memory. When communities reconvene to confront the horrors of fanatical rule, the conversation invariably extends beyond the visible perpetrators to the hidden backers. These women, whether they embraced power or complied out of necessity, formed an invisible scaffold for the regime's cruelty. Their actions demonstrate that totalitarian atrocities require not only authoritarian leaders, but also a supporting caste willing to sustain or normalize violence through social acceptance. Exhibitions on Nazi Germany today often feature relics tied to these feminine figures. A satin evening gown found in a confiscated mansion, a fur stole worn at a state dinner, or a scrapbook of party invitations embossed with swastikas, displayed alongside documents and weapons. These artifacts deliver a stark message. Genocide and oppression were not abstract state functions, but social phenomena made possible by men and women who shared a common stage. Curators frame them as the women behind the facade, insisting that understanding the Holocaust and World War II fully demands acknowledging every link in the chain of complicity. Justice for these women was uneven and often delayed. While their male counterparts faced trials and public executions, many of the women lived out their final decades in relative obscurity, sheltered by legal technicalities or sympathetic networks. Yet time's promise of oblivion proved hollow. Academic conferences and human rights commissions periodically revisit their legacies, publishing monographs that chronicle personal affidavits, correspondence, and newly declassified files. In doing so, historians underscore a fundamental truth: statutes of limitation may expire, but moral and historical judgment is perpetual. The memory of their deeds, or willful ignorance, refuses to fade. Across Europe in memorials, school curricula, and public discourse, the specter of these women persists. They remind us that atrocity is a collective enterprise, dependent on more than the few who wield swords. It requires the acquiescence or active support of many. Their final judgment may not be meted out in courtrooms, but in the enduring scrutiny of posterity, where the echoes of their choices resonate as solemn warnings against the silent forces that enable tyranny. The video, The Brutal Last Days of Nazi Wives, From Power to Ruin, is not merely a chronicle of personal tragedies. It is also a profound reminder of the nature of power, blind loyalty, and the consequences of remaining silent in the face of evil. Through the fates of Eva Braun, Magda Goebbels, Emmy Goering, and the so-called SS Roses, we see that atrocities were not committed solely by those who held weapons, but were enabled by a network of supporters on the fringes of political power. These women may not have signed decrees or fired guns, yet their presence, tacit approval, and financial or media support made the regime's tyranny more entrenched and brutal. The most important message the video conveys is that preventing collective crimes requires more than harsh legal measures. It demands a societal reckoning. When confronted with injustice, whether in the past or today, each of us must find the courage to speak out rather than allow individual convictions to be crushed by the majority. Moreover, the video highlights that consequences echo across generations. The children and grandchildren of those implicated bear a burden of dishonor, forced to struggle to restore faith and forge their own identities. Finally, through the harrowing journeys of the women who once lived in the Nazi regime's splendor, we learn a vital lesson about compassion and personal responsibility. Reflecting on history is not about assigning perpetual blame, but about recognizing how every individual, regardless of position, can help build or dismantle a cruel system. Let these memories illuminate our present, preparing us to defend justice and human rights, and to safeguard the values of humanity against the temptations of power and the dangers of indifference.